Today I'm going clay hunting in a deep canyon where I hope to find yellow and green clays, and I'm inviting you to come along with me. Look at these layers in here. This is where this arroyo has cut through a hillside, and up at the very top we have some sandy looking material. And then farther down we have layers and layers of clay, all pretty much the same shade of brown. We've also got a lot of caliche in here as well. So if you're collecting clay, we need to watch out that we don't get any of that caliche in our clay. But there's a lot of different layers of clay in here. And this is just the very opening of the canyon. As we get back in there, there's going to be a lot more different colors and different layers to look at. Look at this here. Look at all this junk washed up into this tree. This is way up 4 or 5 feet. This shows how high the water ran last summer. So here in southern Arizona, we get our monsoon season in July and August, and this creek must have run really deep for this material to be washed up into this tree that high. Okay, so check this out. These layers of clay have been compressed in the earth for thousands of years, pressed into solid chunks, almost rock-like. So as they're opened up and exposed to the weather on the bank of this arroyo, it slowly starts to kind of break down, break back into earth material, back into clay. And so what happens is this creek, this little arroyo, runs along the base of this hill and just eats a little bit out all the time. Every time it flows, it just eats a little more out of this hillside. And then these chunks, these solid chunks of clay, fall down into the arroyo, like this here, see? Big old chunk of clay. And then they sit down here and they just slowly go to pieces and fall apart and turn back into earth as they sit down in this arroyo and are exposed to water. Look at that. Isn't that something? And if you dig back into that hill there, it's solid. It's just solid, almost like a rock. And here we can see this clay turning back into earth right here before our eyes. To tell you the truth, I haven't been up here in a long time. I think probably at least 30 years, because it was before I was married when I was up here last. And my wife and I are celebrating our 31st wedding anniversary next week. So it's been a long time, maybe 1991, 1990, something like that. Now, the way I remember it, there are some really cool, like yellow and green colored clays up in this canyon. But I don't know about you, but you know the way my memory works is sometimes I'll go back to some place I knew when I was younger and it's really different. And not just because it's changed over the years, but because like at some point it seems like my imagination takes over my memory and kind of changes it. So I'm hoping to find those yellow and green clays, but if not, it should be a cool place to explore either way. It's quite possible that many of these layers of sediment were not available to the ancient potters in this area. And the reason is that this arroyo was created by a lot of erosion that happened in the early 20th century. See, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there were a series of droughts that hit this area. And at the same time, there was a great deal of cattle grazing going on out here. So with the large amount of cattle on the land and these droughts, at the same time, it just stripped all the grass off of this area. You see, this whole valley used to be grassland. And today it's mostly mesquite scrub and whitethorn acacia scrub, so it's changed a lot, and that drought and that overgrazing had something to do with it. Anyways, at that time, all these arroyos started to be cut into the land here. So before that, the land surface was probably up there near the top of those bluffs. And this creek was just a low swale, an area that would get wet and marshy in the summertime, but that was generally just a low area with not a lot of erosion, a lot of grass on the banks here. So I found a little spring back here, which is pretty cool. This is a wet time though, because all the snow is melting up on the mountains and flowing down into the valley. So this spring might not be here in another month or so when it starts drying out. I tried to look on my phone to see where I was at in the length of the canyon, and I can't get any internet signal down here. So I guess I'm just gonna press on and see what's on up ahead. Here's a couple of little chunks of a yellowish looking clay that look like they really don't belong here. Almost like a chunk of this clay fell into this other more grayish material around it at some point thousands of years ago. Very interesting. I'm going to keep going up the draw, see if I can find more of this yellow material or maybe even yellower. But if I don't, I could always just carefully pick out little bits here where there's these chunks of yellow. Okay, so the canyon splits right below me here. I came up one side and we can see that this is pretty much the top of this canyon split here. At the top layer here, it looks like we have a really thick layer of caliche. That's just calcium carbonate cemented around particles of sand and gravel, whatnot. So that is no use for us in clay. Below that, there's a few pockets of some reddish clay, which again is, fine, but it's not what we came up here looking for. So I don't see any reason to climb through those rocks there because I don't see anything from here that looks like the yellow or green materials I'm looking for. This is a good place to talk about the dangers of this kind of exploring. Sometimes I get comments from people who say, oh, it's dangerous, you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that. Everything's dangerous to some degree. I drove on Interstate 10 to get here today and the traffic was crazy out there. I also drove through miles and miles of Tucson at rush hour. And that was pretty dangerous too. So, a lot of things are dangerous. So I think common sense should rule. The two things that I keep in mind out here, that are the most dangerous, in my opinion. One is rattlesnakes. There are rattlesnakes out here, and this is a good time of year to find rattlesnakes. They like being up in the brush or up in these rocks like this. Wherever you're walking out here, you need to make sure you can see the ground where you're going to put your feet. Make sure there's no snakes there. If you can't see it, if it's too brushy, walk around or don't go at all. So that's my rule. When I go through places like this that are really rocky, I take my time. I look under every rock that I'm putting my foot near. I look, everywhere to make sure there's no snakes. And even then they can sneak up on you. But keep your eyes open for snakes when you're out in country like this. In this rocky country, that's perfect country for snakes. So that's the first one. The second one is these banks, these high arroyo banks can collapse and crush you. So there was a story in a local newspaper a few years back. There were some people out in this valley, not far from here, and they were collecting fossils, a couple. And the woman was around the corner from the man. The man was up the way, and they were looking for fossils, and they had, probably rock hammers and were digging in the arroyo bank. All of a sudden, she heard this whoomp, like a lot of soil falling. She came around the corner, and this bank had collapsed and just crushed the guy. And she couldn't get him out herself, so she had to go for help. He had the keys to the vehicle in his pocket, so she had to walk. She had to walk to the nearest ranch house, which was several miles away, and they came up with a front end loader to try to get the earth off of him, and of course, it was too late. So these arroyo walls aren't just going to collapse at a minute's notice, but be aware. Look for ones that are kind of overhanging or they look fragile, especially if it's rained recently and it's damp, they're more likely to fall. So that's another thing to be aware of. Look at this. That looks like good clay. Look at the texture of that stuff. It's got that kind of waxy, soapy texture that you expect from really good clay, and green, just as green as can be. That's what I'm looking for right there. That looks nice. Now look at this material below it here. Is that clay? Is that white clay? Totally different texture. I'm gonna guess this is marl. That is calcium carbonate with sediments in it. I'm gonna avoid that, but that's the stuff I'm looking for. That's a nice texture and super green. Well, I found it. I found some decent yellow. I mean, it's not the best yellow clay. It's yellow, don't get me wrong. It just probably isn't pure clay. Gonna need some levigation to kind of clean out some of the junk, but I think I'll get some usable paint out of that at any rate. And I found green, so I found green and yellow. Those were my goals today. So now if you're a potter, you're probably wondering what color these clays will fire. I did some tests recently on different colors of clay and firing them, and you'll want to check that video out to see kind of what green and yellow clays usually fire to. I'll link that video up right over here, so go check that out. Thanks for coming on my adventure with me today. I'll catch you next time.